Secrets Behind the Ruby Mask, a Sherlock Holmes story. Dear listeners, welcome to tonight's Miss Marple mystery. I'm Sam, your host, and I'm delighted to have you here for another captivating tale. Before we settle in, I'd love to hear a bit about you. What do you do, or what did you do for a living? Perhaps you're a chef, a gardener, an artist, or someone with a wonderfully unique story. Share it in the comments. I always enjoy learning more about our incredible community. Now, let's get comfortable. Let the fire crackle softly in the background and drift gently into the world of mystery and intrigue. Tonight, we journey together into the Christmas coffee shop, where secrets simmer beneath the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and a puzzling crime awaits. Settle in, dear listener, and allow the story to unfold. Chapter 1. The Masked Invitation. The evening fog crept along the narrow streets of London, curling around gas lamps and muffling the distant clatter of carriage wheels. Inside the familiar warmth of 221B Baker Street, the fire flickered gently, casting a soft glow on shelves lined with well-thumbed books and curious trinkets collected over many years. The faint scent of Holmes's pipe mingled with the aroma of polished wood and leather-bound volumes, creating a sense of calm, as if the world outside had paused to allow reflection and thought. It was in this quiet, contemplative atmosphere that a delicate sound drew attention, a soft scrape against the door, almost hesitant yet deliberate. Holmes, seated at his desk and lost in thought over a scattering of papers, looked up with a keen, precise gaze. Watson, who had been reclining in his chair with a medical journal in hand, followed the movement, curiosity flickering in his expression. At the foot of the door lay a small envelope, unassuming yet somehow urgent in its placement. Holmes bent to pick it up, noting the subtle unevenness of the paper and the faint scent of perfume lingering at its edges. There was something intentional in the way it had arrived, a whisper of secrecy woven into its very delivery. Breaking the seal, Holmes unfolded the note with deliberate care. The words inside were brief, elegant, and troubling. An invitation to a masquerade ball, a reference to a ruby-masked figure, and a hint of a threat concealed in plain sight. Each line seemed to shimmer with understated menace, as though the author relished the uncertainty they had sown. Watson leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he traced the handwriting and choice of phrasing. "Notice the curl at the end of the R in ruby," he remarked quietly. "And the space before figure, it's almost like a subtle pause, a hidden emphasis." Holmes inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the keen observation. Every detail mattered, no matter how inconspicuous it seemed. Outside, the rain began to fall steadily, tapping against the window pane in soft, rhythmic patterns. Each droplet seemed to underscore the tension in the room, a gentle accompaniment to the questions forming in Holmes's mind. Who was this ruby-masked figure, and why choose to reveal themselves only through a cryptic note? Could this be more than a simple social intrigue, a clever game played in London's grand halls? Holmes allowed his mind to wander through possibilities, considering alliances, motives, and the faintest traces of deception that might lie beneath the mask. Watson, sensing the unspoken intensity, moved closer, offering his quiet support and perceptive insight. Together they examined the letter again, noting subtleties that most would have overlooked: the choice of paper, the slant of the ink, even the faint indentation where the writer's hand had pressed too firmly. It was in these small, overlooked details that Holmes found the first threads of the mystery, hints that would guide them toward understanding the unseen movements of a city shrouded in fog and secrecy. The letter, simple as it appeared, was a door opened into a hidden world. For a long moment they sat in thoughtful silence, the fire crackling softly, the rain murmuring against the glass, and the distant sounds of London muted by the thick evening fog. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of anticipation passing across his features. Somewhere in the city, a figure moved with purpose, concealed beneath a mask of deep ruby red, leaving questions in their wake. And as the shadows deepened and the fog thickened, the sense of waiting, of secrets yet to be revealed, settled into the room like a quiet companion. What would the night uncover? That was a puzzle only time and keen observation could resolve. The evening air was crisp as Holmes and I approached the grand hall where the masquerade ball was already in full swing. Gas lamps glimmered along the entrance, their reflections dancing across the polished cobblestones slick with rain. Inside, the space was a soft swirl of candlelight, velvet drapes, and the muted sparkle of countless masks. Laughter and low conversation mingled with the distant notes of a string quartet, creating a gentle undercurrent of activity that was both lively and refined. It was a scene designed to charm the senses, yet beneath the glitter and gaiety, Holmes suspected the faint stirrings of something more intricate. We moved quietly among the guests, assuming the guise of observers rather than participants. Holmes's eyes, ever alert, flicked from one masked face to another, noting subtle exchanges of glances, the barely perceptible tightening of a hand on a fan, the slight hesitation in a bow. Each gesture seemed to carry meaning, a hidden message beneath the veneer of civility. I followed his lead, my own senses drawn to the faint nuances that the casual eye would overlook, the way a whisper lingered just a moment too long, the brush of silk sleeves that seemed calculated rather than accidental. A delicate hush passed through the room as the masked figures glided gracefully across the floor. The masks themselves were ornate, painted and jewelled, each hiding expressions and intentions with perfect discretion. Yet among the elegant crowd, Holmes's gaze caught a flicker of movement that seemed different, subtle, deliberate, yet fleeting. A shadowy figure glanced toward us, and for a brief instant our eyes met beneath the dim glow of a chandelier. Then, as if drawn by some secret instinct, the figure melted back into the throng, leaving a ripple of unanswered questions in their wake. I felt a faint thrill as a glimmer of red caught my attention near the far side of the ballroom. It was not the soft scarlet of candlelight or the blush of silk, but something deeper, richer, ruby red, like the note that had arrived at Baker Street earlier. I turned to point it out to Holmes, but by the time I did, the figure had vanished once again, leaving no trace but the echo of presence. Holmes's brow furrowed slightly, yet his expression remained calm, as though he were cataloguing every small detail for later consideration. As we wandered further into the hall, observing whispers and exchanged glances, it became clear that alliances and rivalries threaded themselves through the crowd as deftly as the patterns in a tapestry. Some gestures were fleeting, nearly imperceptible, yet they carried the weight of hidden knowledge, small nods, suppressed smiles, and glances that lasted just a fraction too long. Holmes paused frequently, cataloguing these clues with a meticulous patience, his quiet commentary guiding my understanding of the social undercurrent. Even in a room brimming with elegance and charm, the undercurrent of human motive was palpable. The evening wore on, and though the laughter and music continued unabated, a gentle tension settled around us. The ruby-masked figure's presence lingered like a soft shadow at the edge of vision, elusive and mysterious. Each time I thought I had glimpsed them again, they seemed to vanish, leaving only the lingering curiosity of what their intentions might be. Holmes's gaze remained steady, yet there was a hint of anticipation in the set of his shoulders, a promise that the night would reveal more in time. As the orchestra played its final notes for the hour, we quietly withdrew to a shadowed alcove, blending with the murmuring crowd. The masked ball, resplendent as it was, had offered more questions than answers, and the ruby-masked figure remained a puzzle, teasing our curiosity without revealing a single secret. Outside, the fog pressed softly against the windows, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting to see how the evening's intricate dance of masks and motives would unfold. The first threads of the mystery had been touched, yet the full pattern remained tantalizingly just out of reach. Chapter 2. Shadows at Ashford Manor. The morning air was damp with lingering fog, softening the edges of London's streets and muting the usual clatter of carts and carriage wheels. Sunlight struggled to pierce the low clouds, casting a gentle grey glow through the tall windows of Baker Street. Inside, the familiar warmth of 221B was comforting. The fire crackled quietly, books lined the shelves in orderly chaos, and the faint scent of Holmes's pipe mingled with the subtle aroma of yesterday's tea. It was a morning that invited reflection, a pause between the night's intrigue and the mysteries still waiting to be unravelled. Holmes sat at his desk, his sharp gaze examining the materials gathered the previous evening. A torn invitation lay carefully unfolded, its edges ragged but deliberate, as if the note had been ripped in haste or to convey a hidden message. A single glove, delicate and unassuming, rested beside it, the soft leather faintly scented with perfume. Holmes lifted it, turning it over in his hands, his mind already tracing the paths by which it might have travelled. He noted every crease, every tiny smudge, as though the glove itself could whisper the secrets it had witnessed. I settled into my chair nearby, recounting what I had overheard during the masquerade. Voices drifted across the hall, hushed and intimate. Yet fragments of conversation had reached my ears, mention of an upcoming secret auction, names whispered with caution, plans hinted at in the subtlest of tones. Even the way a guest hesitated before speaking carried meaning, suggesting connections and intentions hidden beneath polite smiles. Holmes listened with a quiet intensity, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk as he pieced together patterns invisible to all but the most attentive eye. There was something methodical in the way he worked, a precision that made the scattered clues seem less random and more deliberate. The torn invitation, the glove, even the faint trail of perfume, all were threads in a tapestry Holmes was beginning to reveal. He murmured observations aloud, noting the subtle repetition of certain words, the angles of gestures, the placement of objects in rooms where the masked figure had moved. Each detail was a small step toward understanding a larger, carefully orchestrated plan. Beyond the window, London continued its quiet morning rhythm. Horse hooves clattered softly against wet cobblestones, and distant church bells marked the hour in slow, measured tones. The city seemed blissfully unaware of the delicate web forming in the shadows, of the silent calculations unfolding within Baker Street. It was a gentle contrast, life moving on with comforting normalcy, while a complex intrigue threaded itself through the day, unseen yet deliberate. As I spoke of a fleeting glimpse I had caught near the edge of the ballroom, a ruby pin dropped almost imperceptibly on a velvet tablecloth. Holmes's eyes flicked sharply. He leaned closer, examining the tiny ornament as though it contained a secret in its very facets. It was a small thing, easily overlooked by any ordinary observer, yet it spoke volumes to those who knew how to read such signs. A hint, a whisper, a presence closer than we had imagined, tiny clues accumulating to form the shape of something deliberate and cunning. We spent the morning cataloguing, discussing and tracing connections that might otherwise have seemed coincidental. Each observation sparked another thought, each pattern suggested further inquiry. The quiet murmur of the fire, the soft ticking of the clock, and the distant hum of London beyond the window created a serene backdrop, allowing concentration and curiosity to flourish without interruption. And as Holmes carefully laid out each piece on the desk, a subtle anticipation settled over us, a promise that the next steps in the puzzle were within reach, yet still tantalizingly just beyond our grasp. The ruby pin rested on the surface before us, a tiny gleaming signal that the figure from last night had left more than just an impression. They had left a trail. Holmes's gaze lingered, thoughtful and precise, while I felt the quiet excitement of discovery mixed with the calm patience of a morning spent in careful observation. Somewhere, Somewhere close by, the masked figure had been, and the question of their intentions, why they had moved as they did, what they truly sought, remained poised in the soft, fog-laden London air, waiting for the next step to unfold. The streets of London carried a crisp chill as Holmes and I made our way to the local auction house, its stone facade softened by the morning mist. The usual city bustle hummed around us, vendors calling from their stalls, the faint clatter of wheels over cobblestones, and the distant peal of church bells marking the hour. Inside, the atmosphere shifted subtly, polished oak, faint scents of varnish and aged paper, and the low murmur of conversation among gathered patrons created a world apart from the city streets. Holmes moved quietly through the crowd, his eyes noting everything from the arrangement of items on display to the subtle posture of each attendee, as though the very air whispered its secrets to him. A nervous clerk hovered near the entrance, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his fingers twisting the hem of his waistcoat. Holmes approached with gentle composure, speaking in calm tones that seemed to ease the clerk's anxiety while drawing out information. "You mentioned earlier a certain artifact," Holmes said softly, his gaze steady. The clerk flushed, glancing around as if fearing unseen observers.
"Ah, yes.
"The ruby mask," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper, "encrusted with jewels belonging to the Harrowby family. Quite a piece."
"Rare, delicate, and immensely valuable." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest.
He allowed the clerk to speak further, observing the small tremors in his hands, the hesitant glance toward the display, and the way his words carried both pride and fear. It was clear that someone, perhaps the same ruby-masked figure we had glimpsed at the ball, had taken a particular interest in the artifact. Holmes's mind traced possibilities, the purpose of its acquisition, the timing of the auction, and the subtle currents of desire and secrecy flowing beneath the polite conversations. Each detail seemed to suggest a careful plan, executed with precision and patience. Meanwhile, I lingered near the window, observing the streets beyond the auction house. Carriages rolled past in steady cadence. Pedestrians moved with purpose, yet oblivious to the undercurrents of intrigue surrounding them. A young messenger paused at a lamppost, exchanging a small note with a passerby before disappearing into the fog. Such ordinary exchanges, easily ignored, hinted at a network of signals that only someone attuned to subtle movements might perceive. I felt the city's pulse, alive yet masking deeper intentions, and quietly noted each small nuance to share with Holmes later. Returning my attention indoors, I watched Holmes quietly catalogue the scene, the placement of bidders, the positioning of artifacts, the slight hesitations in certain gestures, all minute, yet significant to those who could interpret them. The ruby mask rested on a velvet cushion beneath soft lighting, its surface catching glimmers of the chandelier above. Even in its stillness, it seemed to command attention, a focal point for hidden motives and concealed desires. Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line, his mind clearly tracing unseen connections and potential outcomes. The auction hall's ambient sounds, the murmur of conversation, the occasional scrape of a chair, the subtle clink of fine china from a distant refreshment table created a gentle tapestry of noise,
masking yet revealing at the same time.
Holmes leaned toward me, voice low and measured. "Stakes, Watson, are far higher than mere social curiosity," he murmured. "This is no casual pursuit of an artifact. Someone has invested thought, intent, and perhaps more than a hint of danger in this endeavour." His words hung softly in the air, mingling with the warm scent of polished wood and the faint shimmer of morning sunlight filtering through the high windows. As we withdrew from the auction house, leaving the hum of activity behind, a subtle tension remained. The ruby mask had revealed only part of its story, and the shadow of the masked figure loomed larger in our minds. The city outside seemed indifferent, continuing its daily rhythm, yet every footstep, every glance, and every flutter of movement felt imbued with meaning. Holmes's pace was unhurried, yet I sensed the intensity of his consideration. The web of intrigue was growing more complex, and we were only beginning to understand how carefully the threads had been woven. Chapter 3. Clues in the Fog. The carriage rumbled along the quiet lanes leading to the Harrowby estate, the morning fog curling around towering hedges and wrought-iron gates. Even in the soft light, the grandeur of the house was apparent. Stone facades adorned with intricate carvings, tall windows framed with ivy, and a sense of history that seemed to whisper from every corner. Holmes's eyes flicked across the facade with practiced attention, noting the symmetry of the carvings, the weathered inscriptions above the doorway, and the faint traces of recent repairs. Each detail suggested pride, care, and the subtle assertion of status, yet also hinted at family secrets that had long been kept behind closed doors. Inside, the house carried a hushed reverence. The soft crackle of the fireplace in the great hall added warmth and comfort, casting dancing shadows across the polished floors and carefully arranged furniture. Portraits of stern-looking ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow our movements with quiet judgment. Holmes paused before each, his gaze sharp, noting not just the likenesses but the small anomalies, a shifted frame, the faint impression of erased signatures, the subtle choice of background symbols. To him, these were more than decoration. They were hints, clues embedded in tradition and image. I followed, cataloguing the household's subtle rhythms. A servant's hurried glance, a quiet whisper in a corridor, the barely noticeable tension between siblings at the breakfast table. Each nuance added layers to a story that remained largely unspoken. Holmes's mind, as always, worked with meticulous precision, piecing together these small human signals. Even a brief hesitation before serving tea, or the careful avoidance of certain subjects in conversation, suggested histories of betrayal, ambition, or resentment. The ruby mask's connection to the family became increasingly apparent, though its precise purpose remained just beyond reach. Holmes moved toward a side table where a collection of letters had been gathered for our inspection. He handled each one with care, his eyes scanning for meaning beyond the surface words. Faint smudges of ink, marginal notes, and the deliberate phrasing of certain passages spoke of alliances formed and broken, promises kept and violated. Each revelation deepened the sense of intrigue, revealing a family whose external elegance masked turbulent currents beneath. The soft hum of the fire and the faint ticking of a nearby clock lent a gentle rhythm to our observations, blending comfort with an underlying sense of unease. In one of the rooms, a painting caught Holmes's attention, a serene landscape, yet upon closer inspection, the composition seemed deliberate in its oddities, a shadow misplaced, a figure obscured, and a crimson glint in the corner that echoed the colour of the ruby mask. He leaned closer, murmuring softly as he traced the hidden meanings with a practised eye. I, too, felt a shiver of anticipation, aware that each carefully placed symbol and every deliberate omission in the household was part of a story waiting to be deciphered. Throughout our visit, the atmosphere was at once comforting and charged with subtle tension. The rustle of silk, the soft footfalls along polished wood, and the occasional murmur of voices blended seamlessly with the crackle of the fire. London's fog-bound streets seemed distant and irrelevant, while within these walls, history, secrecy, and human ambition intersected in ways that promised both revelation and further mystery. Holmes catalogued everything, the gestures, the expressions, the weight of silence between words, assembling a mental map of relationships and motives that was intricate yet incomplete. By the time we prepared to leave, a clearer picture of the family's dynamics had emerged, rivalries veiled in civility, whispers of betrayal carefully hidden behind polished manners, and an unspoken ambition that may well have drawn the ruby-masked figure to this very household. Yet even with these revelations, the full pattern remained tantalizingly just out of reach. The fireplace crackled softly behind us as we stepped toward the carriage, carrying the warmth of comfort into the chill of the London streets, our minds alive with curiosity and the sense that the next piece of the puzzle awaited only a careful observation away. The evening descended slowly over London, the fog thickening as twilight settled into the streets. Gas lamps cast a muted golden glow that barely pierced the mist, their light reflecting softly on slick cobblestones. Holmes and I had just returned from our visit to the Harrowby estate when a quiet knock at the door drew our attention. The visitor, a slight man with anxious eyes and a hurried gait, introduced himself with a whispered urgency.
"Mr. Holmes."
"Someone has been following you," he said, voice barely above the hush of the rain tapping against the window. "I did not wish to alarm you in the daylight, but the shadow has been persistent." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained calm. He listened intently, absorbing every word while cataloguing the man's gestures and tone. The visitor explained that he had noticed a figure lingering at a distance, always careful to remain unseen, yet unmistakably present. Even as he spoke, the faint creak of floorboards from the street below suggested the world outside was alive with subtle movements, hinting at dangers concealed beneath ordinary city life. We wrapped our coats tightly and ventured into the fog-laden streets, the muted sounds of London a constant companion. Each step echoed softly, and the distant clip-clop of hooves on wet stone provided an irregular rhythm that underscored the quiet tension. Holmes led the way with measured precision, noting the faint impressions left by footsteps in puddles, the occasional shift of shadows under gas lamps, and the subtle alignment of windows that might allow a curious observer a glimpse without exposure. Every detail, however minor, became a potential thread in the pattern he sought to unravel. I followed closely, my eyes alert to the mist-shrouded corners of alleyways and the glimmer of lanterns reflected in rain-slicked surfaces. Somewhere ahead, Holmes believed, the shadow moved with intent, leaving a trail of invisible breadcrumbs for those careful enough to notice. Then, just as we rounded a narrow bend, a sudden flash of red silk caught my attention, a glimmer so fleeting it might have been imagined. Holmes paused, his gaze fixed on the spot where the colour had danced, and in that instant I felt the unmistakable thrill of proximity to the unknown. The red vanished as swiftly as it appeared, swallowed by the fog and the labyrinthine alleys of the city. We pressed on, following the subtle cues that only the sharpest eye could detect: a hastily closed shutter, a door left slightly ajar, a shadow that lingered too long in a side passage. Holmes's mind moved like a finely tuned instrument, connecting seemingly disparate observations into a coherent, though incomplete, narrative. Each clue, each movement, each whispered sound contributed to a growing understanding that the ruby-masked figure was not merely a social intrigue, but an active participant in a calculated game. Despite the thrill of the pursuit, there was a comforting rhythm to our steps, the quiet crunch of gravel, the distant hum of traffic muted by fog, the occasional drip of water from eaves. These gentle sensory details balanced the tension with calm awareness, keeping the scene immersive without overwhelming. Holmes murmured softly, his voice barely audible. "Notice the way the shadows fall, Watson? There is pattern here, deliberate and careful." I nodded, tracing each subtle cue as we moved, aware that every misstep might obscure the truth rather than reveal it. As the alleyways twisted and turned, the presence of the ruby-masked figure lingered in memory, elusive yet unmistakable. The city seemed to fold around us, the fog and muted light conspiring to obscure the next movement. A sense of anticipation hung in the air, an unspoken question of when and in what manner the figure might emerge again. The trail we followed was incomplete, tantalizingly just beyond our grasp, and the soft echo of footsteps fading into the mist left a quiet, persistent curiosity lingering in our minds. The night promised more revelations, yet held them just out of reach. Chapter 4. The Ruby's Tale. The morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of Baker Street, mingling with the lingering warmth of the fire that still glowed in the hearth. Holmes sat at his desk, the open ledger of the Harrowby family spread before him like a map of secrets. The pages, yellowed with age, bore neat columns of figures, entries in looping handwriting, and subtle annotations that spoke of careful, deliberate planning. Holmes's eyes moved swiftly, scanning numbers and notes with precision, pausing occasionally to tilt his head and trace a line or highlight a curious detail. Each smudge of ink, each missing signature, seemed a deliberate signal rather than mere oversight. I leaned back in my chair, watching him work while my own thoughts wandered to the quiet streets outside. London moved as it always did. The distant tolling of a church bell echoed faintly through the morning fog. Carriages clattered over wet stones, and the muted hum of daily life continued, oblivious to the intricacies of human intention unfolding in a small room above Baker Street. There was comfort in the familiarity of the city, yet a subtle tension lingered, a quiet awareness that the calm facade masked a web of motives and actions that might soon come to light. Holmes paused over a particular entry, his finger tracing a line connecting the ruby mask to a series of transactions that suggested careful preparation. It was not just a piece of jewelry, nor simply a symbol of wealth. It was an object around which ambition, secrecy, and perhaps even desperation had coalesced. The ledger revealed patterns in the timing of payments, the unusual routing of funds, and entries that suggested someone had been planning for this event over many months. Each detail, small as it appeared, contributed to a larger picture of intention and opportunity. I noticed the subtle tension in Holmes's posture as he worked. His mind seemed to move several steps ahead of the present, cataloguing possibilities and predicting outcomes with the quiet confidence of someone attuned to patterns that most would never see. The ledger, a seemingly mundane record of numbers and notes, became a window into the ambitions and fears of a family whose public facade of elegance concealed intricate schemes. Even the smallest inconsistencies, the extra line in a signature, the faint smudge along a margin, told stories of hidden alliances, concealed debts or veiled threats. Holmes spoke quietly, almost to himself as he began piecing together a timeline. "Consider the rhythm of these transactions," he murmured, his voice calm yet precise. "Each one falls into place with the meticulous care of someone aware that the smallest deviation could unravel the entire plan. The ruby mask is not a mere curiosity, it is a fulcrum around which actions will pivot.
And we must anticipate every movement if we are to understand its role." His words carried weight.
Even in the stillness of the room, blending analytical observation with the quiet suspense of discovery. Outside, the morning light shifted slowly, casting long shadows across the pavement and illuminating the faint haze that clung to the city. The distant sounds, the murmur of street vendors, the occasional creak of a carriage wheel, served as gentle punctuation to our contemplation. Holmes's gaze remained steady on the ledger, yet I felt the quiet thrill of anticipation as the pieces of the puzzle began to align. Patterns emerged, suggesting not only the immediate intentions of the masked figure, but also the subtle dynamics within the family itself. Rivalries, ambitions and grievances carefully hidden behind polite manners and courteous smiles. By mid-morning, Holmes had begun to form a picture of what might follow. He traced the movements implied by the ledger, the timing of the auctions, and the subtle signals embedded in letters and accounts. The masked figure's next move, while not entirely certain, had become more predictable through careful reasoning and observation. And as the fire crackled softly beside us, lending warmth to the quiet room, a sense of calm vigilance settled in the space. London outside carried on in its usual rhythm, yet within these walls, a web of intrigue had begun to reveal itself, delicate and precise. waiting for the next thread to be pulled. The night had settled over London like a soft, dark veil, the fog curling around chimneys and rooftops, blurring the edges of familiar streets. Holmes and I climbed to a dimly lit rooftop, our boots silent against the worn tiles, the distant glow of gas lamps casting a muted golden shimmer on wet cobblestones below. The city hummed faintly, its sounds softened by the mist, the occasional clip-clop of a carriage wheel, the muted murmur of voices carried along narrow lanes, and the soft echo of footsteps disappearing into side streets. From this vantage, London seemed almost serene, yet beneath its calm lay currents of movement and intent, invisible to the casual eye. Holmes crouched beside me, his eyes sweeping the streets with methodical precision. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "Even in the seeming stillness patterns emerge. Notice the spacing of lights, the rhythm of footsteps, the brief flicker of shadow that does not belong to a passer-by. These are the subtle markers of deliberate movement." I followed his gaze, noting the occasional figure darting across intersections or pausing under a lamp-post, always alert, always careful. Each motion seemed purposeful, as though the city itself were a stage and we were granted the rare privilege of observing behind the curtain. A shadow moved along the narrow street below, stopping occasionally to glance upward as though sensing our watchful presence. Its movements were deliberate, calculated and quiet. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, cataloguing every detail. The angle of a pause, the glint of something red beneath the cloak, the faint weight shift that hinted at alertness and caution. I too traced the figure's path, noting the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the muted reflections in puddles, and the rustle of fabric that spoke of deliberate movement rather than hurried flight. Holmes whispered several possible scenarios, each one carefully weighed. "The figure is not merely passing through," he said softly. "There is intent, and intent of a kind that requires patience and observation. It may be testing the waters, gauging reactions, or confirming that a path is clear. In any case, it is aware enough to pause, aware enough to vanish when necessary." The night air was crisp against our faces, yet the quiet tension drew our senses inward, focused on the subtle symphony of motion and silence that the city offered. Suddenly, the figure slipped into a narrow alley, disappearing into darkness so complete that even the faint gaslight could not penetrate it. A soft clatter of a discarded object echoed briefly, and then all was still once more, leaving the rooftops silent except for the distant, rhythmic toll of a church bell. Holmes leaned back, contemplative, fingers steepled as he reviewed the scene in his mind. Every pause, every glance, every carefully measured step offered clues, yet together they formed a tantalizingly incomplete picture. The ruby-red glint we had glimpsed, so brief, so fleeting, seemed to pulse in memory like a heartbeat,
a signal that the figure was both near and elusive. I scribbled notes quietly,
capturing the details that Holmes had observed and my own impressions of the city's nocturnal rhythm. There was a delicate thrill in this shared vigilance. The tension was real, yet never overwhelming, cushioned by the muted fog, the warm memory of our firelit rooms, and the calm deliberation of observation. The city below was both familiar and mysterious, a labyrinth in which secrets moved as quietly as the fog itself. As we finally descended from the rooftop, the sense of anticipation lingered like a soft echo. The figure had vanished, leaving only questions and the faint imprint of intention. Holmes's mind was already working through possibilities, aligning observed details with past patterns and known motives. For us, for the careful listener, it was a moment poised between revelation and uncertainty, a quiet pause in which the story held its breath, and curiosity drew gently forward, inviting all to lean in and wait for what would come next. Chapter 5. Secrets Unveiled. The streets of London were hushed that afternoon, the fog retreating just enough to reveal glimmers of sunlight bouncing off damp cobblestones. Holmes and I walked in silence toward a small, discreet jewellery shop tucked between two larger buildings, its wooden sign swaying gently in the light breeze. The scent of polished wood and faint metalwork drifted through the air, welcoming yet precise, like a carefully arranged prelude to discovery. Inside, the shop was quiet, the soft ticking of a clock on the wall accompanying the occasional creak of floorboards as we moved among the display cases. Holmes's eyes swept across the room with deliberate attention. Every object, from delicate chains to glittering gemstones, was catalogued in his mind. Yet it was the collection of masks prominently displayed under soft lamplight that drew his gaze most intently. Each was carefully arranged, yet he noted minute scratches along edges, faint imperfections that suggested recent handling or subtle tampering. The ruby mask, of course, was nowhere to be seen, but the evidence it left, small, almost imperceptible, was enough to ignite Holmes's analytical curiosity. The jeweller himself hovered nearby, fidgeting with a polishing cloth, his movements precise yet edged with unease. His eyes darted toward Holmes, then quickly away, as if aware of scrutiny, yet unsure how to respond. I observed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the quickening of his breath as he adjusted a tray of gemstones, the way his hands trembled slightly when reaching for a pair of delicate earrings. Even without words, the atmosphere suggested both caution and concern, and I noted these cues quietly, knowing Holmes would interpret them with his usual precision. Holmes approached the jeweller with his characteristic calm authority, inquiring softly about recent repairs and acquisitions, never pressing too hard, yet leaving no space for evasion. The jeweller offered carefully chosen words, polite yet constrained, revealing only fragments of the truth. Holmes's eyes flicked to the display cases again, noting the consistency of scratches, the faint residue of polish, and the meticulous arrangement of each mask. It was a pattern of intention, subtle yet deliberate, suggesting that the masked figure had been methodical in their actions, moving with both caution and purpose. As I observed, the quiet of the shop seemed to amplify every minor sound, the soft scrape of a chair, the subtle jingle of coins in a distant till, the almost imperceptible sigh of the jeweller as he arranged a tray of gemstones. These small sensory details, gentle as they were, enhanced the tension and drew attention to the meticulous nature of the investigation. Holmes's mind, as always, worked several steps ahead, piecing together timing, motive, and opportunity from the faintest evidence. Every scratch, every hesitant glance, every tiny irregularity became a thread to follow. By the time we prepared to leave, a sense of cautious understanding had begun to form. The masked figure's strategy was not reckless. It was deliberate, careful, and precisely executed. Holmes's notes hinted at motives and intentions that stretched beyond simple acquisition of wealth or curiosity. The ruby mask itself had become a symbol, a focal point around which unseen forces and intricate plans converged. The jeweller, nervous though he appeared, had unwittingly provided another layer of insight, illuminating the depth of the figure's precision and care. Outside, London streets were quiet, the hum of distant carriages softened by the lingering fog. Holmes walked a few steps ahead, cataloguing every sight and sound, while I followed with a reflective calm, taking in the city's subtle rhythms. The day's discoveries had revealed more than simple facts. They had revealed character, intent, and strategy. And as we rounded the corner, the anticipation of the next revelation settled over us like a soft, persistent fog, urging careful observation and patient deduction. The pursuit was far from over, and every small detail promised another step closer to understanding the elusive, ruby-masked figure. The evening air was crisp and fragrant with damp earth as Holmes unfolded the letter on the desk of 221B. The script was intricate, a careful cipher of curves and flourishes that suggested both intelligence and secrecy. "A rendezvous," he murmured, tracing the elegant lines with his finger. "In a secluded garden under cover of night." I leaned in, trying to imagine the location, moonlight glinting on wet leaves, statues peering silently through the mist, and the quiet tension of shadows dancing just beyond perception. We left shortly after, stepping into London's starlit streets. The gas lamps cast a gentle glow on cobblestones, slicked by a light drizzle, creating reflections that shimmered with every step. Above us, stars peered through breaks in the clouds, their distant twinkle offering a calm counterpoint to the night's unfolding intrigue. Holmes moved with deliberate caution, eyes scanning every alley, every doorway, cataloguing subtle cues as we proceeded toward the rendezvous. I followed, my senses alert to the faint rustle of leaves, the soft echo of distant footsteps, and the occasional flutter of wings from startled pigeons. As we approached the garden, a low wall shrouded in ivy came into view. Shadows moved among the hedges and statues, fleeting and precise, as if the night itself were in motion. Holmes paused, his gaze sharp, noting the careful rhythm of steps and the slight shifts of light across the stone figures.
"Notice the spacing of movement," he whispered.
"Even in apparent randomness, there is intent." The mist clung to the air, damp and cool, carrying the scent of wet foliage and polished stone, blending comfort with suspense as we tread carefully along the narrow path. We followed a series of subtle signs, a footprint pressed into soft soil, a slight indentation in the moss atop a statue, and a faint scrape along the iron railing that bordered a hidden corner. Each clue guided us deeper into the garden, drawing us past flowering shrubs whose petals glistened with rain, and statues whose eyes seemed to watch silently. Holmes's precision was meticulous. He paused often, bending low to examine a scuff or a displaced leaf, his mind clearly tracing the masked figure's path with careful deduction. A sudden shift in the garden caught our attention. A small archway, partially hidden by climbing ivy, revealed a narrow passage that seemed to lead beneath the estate. Holmes crouched beside it, his fingers brushing away the damp leaves to expose a hidden latch. The passage exhaled a faint scent of earth and aged stone, and a hush settled over the night. It was a quiet, deliberate design, clearly meant to conceal movement, and it suggested that the ruby-masked figure's plan was far more complex and dangerous than we had anticipated. I shivered slightly in the cool night air, aware of the delicate balance between curiosity and caution. Holmes's eyes sparkled with anticipation, not fear, as he traced the pathway with deliberate care. Even as the shadows deepened and the mist thickened, the garden retained a strange serenity, blending mystery with comfort in a way that was uniquely London, familiar yet filled with secrets. A faint glint of red, almost imperceptible under the silver glow of the moon, caught the corner of my eye, and I knew that our elusive figure had been here, leaving traces as subtle as whispers. As we emerged from the hidden passage, the night seemed to hold its breath. Questions lingered in the damp air. Who was the ruby-masked figure? What precisely was the end of this carefully orchestrated plan? And how close were we to uncovering the truth? Holmes's gaze remained steady, analytical, yet a subtle tension threaded through the quiet streets and moonlit garden. For listeners, the sense of anticipation balanced comfort with suspense, leaving a gentle but persistent curiosity about the next move, and the promise that the mystery would soon deepen further. Chapter 6. The Chase Through Shadows. The evening was calm in Baker Street, with only the soft tick of the mantel clock and the gentle crackle of the fire accompanying our thoughts. Holmes had gathered a collection of letters, diaries, and notes from the Harrowby estate, spreading them meticulously across the desk. Each page was a delicate fragment of a story long buried, tales of greed, betrayal, and identities concealed behind layers of courtesy and civility. The handwriting varied from elegant flourishes to rushed scrawls, reflecting both character and circumstance, and Holmes studied each one with that quiet intensity that seemed to slow time itself, I observed, with a mixture of fascination and reflection, noting the subtle emotions embedded in the family correspondence. A carefully worded apology hinted at guilt, a forgotten signature betrayed impatience, and the careful phrasing of certain lines suggested alliances formed in secret. Even the punctuation carried meaning. A dash here, a period there, the placement of commas, all small yet deliberate signals pointing to the currents of human behavior beneath the polished surface of polite society. It was a study in both psychology and history, revealing the delicate interplay between ambition and sentiment. Holmes's eyes moved with remarkable precision, connecting details that might appear trivial to the casual observer. He traced patterns of expenditure alongside mentions of the ruby mask, cross-referenced dates in diaries with letters of complaint, and noted the subtle repetition of names, phrases, and incidents. Slowly, a web began to form, a network of motives, hidden connections, and long-forgotten grievances. One particularly faded letter described a masked ball decades earlier, hinting at a scandal that had been carefully erased from public memory. The ruby mask, it seemed, was more than a mere artifact. It was a key to a story that had lain dormant, now revived through carefully orchestrated actions. Outside the window, London moved on with its usual quiet rhythm. Horse-drawn carriages creaked softly along wet streets, lamps flickered in the evening fog, and the distant hum of conversation from taverns and homes created a comforting backdrop. The city's calm contrasted sharply with the intensity of our pursuit within Baker Street, yet it lent a gentle, grounding presence, a reminder that life carried on, even as secrets and ambitions danced invisibly across the city. Holmes's mind, however, remained entirely on the web of intrigue. Each revelation from the letters and diaries sharpened his deductions, yet the story retained layers of mystery, resisting full exposure. I noticed the subtle excitement in his demeanor, the precise tightening of a hand, the faint furrow in his brow as he connected two seemingly unrelated events, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he anticipated what might follow. Every clue, every observation seemed to reinforce a growing certainty that the masked figure's motives were rooted in history, in family secrets carefully guarded, and in ambitions that had not diminished with time. Yet, the ultimate plan remained just beyond reach, a tantalizing horizon against which Holmes's reasoning stretched. A particular diary entry drew his attention, a series of notes regarding a disputed inheritance, interlaced with references to masquerades and veiled warnings. Holmes traced the connections, murmuring softly, greed, secrecy, a concealed identity, all converging at the present moment. I sensed the depth of his realization. The masked figure was no mere social interloper. The figure's movements, choices, and strategies were deliberate, each step calculated against a backdrop of history and personal interest. As the fire flickered and shadows danced across the walls, a quiet tension settled over the room. The next move of the ruby-masked figure was imminent, though its exact form remained invisible to us. The city outside continued its gentle hum, yet within the walls of Baker Street, past and present intertwined, motives and secrets aligned, and the promise of revelation loomed tantalizingly close. The night held its breath, and we too waited, poised on the edge of discovery, acutely aware that the next action would draw the mystery into sharper focus, yet perhaps reveal even deeper layers of intrigue. The night had deepened over London, and a soft rain began to fall, turning the cobblestones slick and reflective beneath the dim glow of gas lamps. Holmes and I moved cautiously through the streets, our footsteps muffled by the gentle patter of rain and the quiet hum of the city. Every shadow seemed alive, every glint of wet stone catching the light like a subtle signal. We had been tracking the faint trail of the ruby-masked figure for hours, following a series of carefully concealed signs, and the anticipation had settled over us like the fog itself, thick, gentle, yet charged with expectation. Ahead, a shadow shifted at the corner of a narrow street, briefly illuminated by the glow of a passing lamp. Holmes's keen eyes narrowed. "There," he whispered, pointing ever so slightly, voice calm yet precise. My own gaze followed his, and for a fleeting moment I saw it too, the unmistakable glimmer of red silk beneath a dark cloak. The figure paused, seemingly aware of our watch, before moving with measured speed, slipping silently into the embrace of another shadowed alley. Holmes's attention was acute, cataloguing every detail with methodical care. He noticed a subtle limp in the figure's gait, a small but deliberate hand gesture, the slight hesitation before each movement. These were clues most would overlook, yet for Holmes they were pieces of a larger puzzle, hints at identity and intent. "Mark these details, Watson," he murmured softly.
Every motion carries information. Every hesitation speaks of circumstance. Observation is as much about subtlety as it is about presence. I noted the rhythm,
The gestures, and even the fleeting expressions that passed beneath the mask's concealment, aware that we were skimming the surface of revelation. The rain thickened, a gentle curtain that softened sounds and shadows alike. Carriages clattered distantly, muted by the damp night air, and a faint breeze carried the scent of wet stone and earth. Even as the city seemed to absorb noise and movement, the tension between us and the ruby-masked figure remained vivid, a delicate thread stretching taut through the quiet streets. Holmes's calm composure provided balance, his precise reasoning steady against the thrill of near discovery, and I felt a mixture of excitement and measured caution in response. We followed for several blocks, glimpsing the figure intermittently, just long enough to catch the red shimmer of silk, the brief sway of a cloak, or the careful placement of gloved hands. Yet each time we closed the distance, the figure vanished into alleys or behind high walls, leaving only small telling traces, a footprint in a puddle, the faint scrape of a glove along wrought iron, or a shadow that lingered a heartbeat longer than it should. The pursuit was tantalizingly close, yet the mystery remained intact, the masked figure's movements precise and elusive. Holmes paused beneath a lamp-post, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Patience, Watson," he said softly. "The clues are here, scattered across the night, yet they require careful interpretation. To act too quickly is to risk losing the thread entirely. We must allow the figure to reveal more of their pattern, while we remain attentive to the minutiae." The gentle sound of rain, the muffled city noises, and the distant echoes of carriage wheels created a rhythm that blended suspense with comfort, immersing us fully in the night's quiet intrigue. As we finally stepped back to survey the streets once more, the ruby-masked figure was gone, leaving only the lingering impression of intent and careful design. Questions hung in the damp air. Who moved with such precision? What drove their relentless pursuit of the ruby mask? And when might they strike again? The tension remained soft yet persistent, inviting reflection and anticipation. London carried on around us, serene and misty, yet beneath its calm surface a thread of danger and intrigue pulsed, promising that the next encounter would bring revelation, and perhaps further secrets hidden in plain sight. Chapter 7. Confrontations and Confessions. The evening settled over Baker Street with its familiar quietude, the soft flicker of candlelight casting long, gentle shadows across the room. Holmes sat at his desk, letters and small artifacts from the Harrowby estate carefully spread before him. The warm glow illuminated the delicate curves of handwriting and the subtle details of each object, from tiny scratches on a mask to faint stains on an envelope. It was a familiar ritual, one that drew me into the rhythm of his thought as much as it illuminated the clues themselves. Holmes's eyes were keen and precise, moving across each piece with deliberate attention. "Watson," he murmured, tapping a letter, "there is something here that has escaped notice until now. A contradiction subtle but significant. It suggests that someone previously considered trustworthy may, in fact, have knowledge of or even a connection to the ruby-masked figure." I leaned in closer, noting the careful alignment of dates, the faint smudge along a signature. and the unusual phrasing in a passage that had seemed innocuous before. Each detail, small as it was, hinted at hidden intentions and unspoken alliances. The candlelight danced softly on the table, flickering across small artifacts we had collected. A stray glove, a fragment of red silk, and a torn corner of an invitation. The gentle shadows lent the scene a cozy, reflective quality, as though the room itself were participating in the unfolding puzzle. Holmes spoke quietly, each word measured, drawing me into the analytic rhythm of his mind. He traced connections slowly, deliberately, linking prior observations to this newly recognized contradiction, revealing the first subtle threads of the masked figure's hidden identity. I listened, absorbed as he explained his deductions with calm clarity. "It is rarely the obvious that misleads, Watson," he said softly, "but rather the carefully hidden gesture, the almost imperceptible alignment of behavior and opportunity. Here, these contradictions converge. The puzzle begins to show its edges. Each revelation was tempered with restraint, allowing the tension to build gently rather than overwhelm, maintaining the warmth of our shared reflection. By the time Holmes paused, a clearer yet still incomplete picture had begun to emerge. The ruby-masked figure's identity was no longer wholly a mystery. Subtle hints had begun to coalesce into shape, and yet the full truth remained tantalizingly out of reach, teasing both of us with the promise of discovery just beyond our grasp. The evening air outside was still, the city's distant murmur soft against the quiet room, leaving a gentle curiosity hanging in the space, a quiet invitation to lean in, to anticipate the approaching climax of a story woven with care, secrecy, and human complexity. The streets leading to the city's outskirts were shrouded in fog, the gas lamps casting dim pools of light that barely penetrated the mist. Holmes and I approached the abandoned manor with measured caution, each step on the damp path echoing faintly against the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and aged wood, carrying the quiet promise of discovery. Even in the distance, the manor seemed to breathe history, its shuttered windows and climbing ivy whispering of secrets long left undisturbed. Inside, shadows twisted along the corridors as we moved, our lantern casting a warm, wavering glow on dust-coated floors and faded wallpaper. Every creak of a floorboard and subtle rustle of decaying drapery heightened our awareness, yet the atmosphere remained strangely comforting, a quiet stage for careful observation. Holmes paused at each turn, studying minor irregularities, a shifted tile, the faint outline of a handprint on a banister, or the way shadows lingered unnaturally along a wall. Each detail hinted at deliberate concealment, suggesting that this manor had been prepared to hide more than mere objects. We discovered a narrow staircase leading beneath the main hall, its entrance partially obscured by an old tapestry. The steps groaned softly beneath our weight as we descended into a hidden chamber below. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint scent of aged parchment and polished wood. Holmes's eyes lit with quiet intensity as we entered a room lined with shelves and tables cluttered with artifacts, documents, and remnants of careful planning. Here lay the tools of the masked figure's strategy, sketches of gatherings, detailed accounts, letters hinting at past grievances, and objects arranged with meticulous intent. I moved among the scattered papers, noticing subtle patterns in the organization, dates, names, and references that slowly began to reveal the motives behind the ruby-masked figure's actions. Holmes studied the artifacts with his usual precision, noting traces of wear, minute scratches, and subtle imperfections that spoke of both care and urgency. "Observe, Watson," he said softly. "Every detail matters. The past is woven into the present, and here, these items serve as a map of intention." I could sense the weight of revelation in his calm voice, the quiet excitement of understanding just beyond reach. Yet, even as the chamber's secrets unfolded, the figure itself remained absent, elusive, like a phantom moving just beyond perception. The manuscripts hinted at ambition, betrayal, and long-held grudges, but the ruby-masked presence that had haunted our steps was still unseen. Outside, the wind whispered through broken windows, and the distant city hummed faintly, contrasting the stillness of the chamber. The combination of discovery and absence created a delicate tension, a promise that the ultimate revelation was imminent but not yet complete. As we paused, surveying the room and its carefully concealed truths, a soft shiver of anticipation lingered in the air. Every artifact, every letter, and every shadow suggested that we were on the cusp of understanding, yet the ruby-masked figure's final move remained hidden. The quiet thrill of near discovery settled gently over us, leaving a lingering question. When, and in what form, would the figure finally reveal themselves? The manor seemed to breathe with secrets, and in its silent depths the mystery waited patiently, inviting the next step into revelation. Chapter 8. Resolution and Reflection. The gallery was hushed, the dim glow of wall sconces casting a soft amber light across velvet drapes and aged paintings. Holmes led the way, his footsteps measured and silent against the polished floorboards, while I followed closely, mindful of the faint echo that carried through the high-ceilinged room. Every detail seemed amplified in the quiet, the soft tick of a distant clock, the whisper of our coats as we moved, the subtle shift of shadows along ornate frames. It was a space steeped in history, and yet that history now felt charged with imminent revelation. From the far corner, a figure emerged, the ruby mask glinting faintly in the lamplight. There was a deliberate grace in their movements, a cautious poise that suggested both awareness and intent. Holmes's eyes, sharp and unwavering, catalogued every gesture, the tilt of the head, the measured step, the faint tension in gloved hands. "I presume you have been expecting this evening," Holmes began, his voice calm yet carrying the weight of command, each word precise, like the placement of a chess piece. The masked figure responded with a soft nod, the eyes behind the mask flickering with something between defiance and regret. I took in the scene with quiet attention, the mingling of shadow and light, the gentle rustle of drapery as the figure shifted, and the faint scent of aged paper and candle wax that lingered in the air. Holmes moved slowly, deliberately bridging the distance between observation and confrontation. "You have woven a careful web," he continued, "one built on secrecy, deception, and long-buried ambition. Yet, even the most intricate of designs cannot escape scrutiny forever." The ruby-masked figure remained silent, their posture controlled, revealing little. Yet each subtle movement betrayed tension. Holmes began to unravel the story, connecting each previously observed clue, the tiny scratches in the jeweller's display, the coded letters, the hidden passage in the garden,
and the contradictions in family correspondence.
"Every motion, every hesitation, every faint glimmer of colour you left behind spoke volumes," he said softly, yet with undeniable clarity. The figure's motives, once hidden beneath layers of artifice and intention, began to emerge, ambition intertwined with legacy, secrecy entwined with personal desire. The gallery itself seemed to participate, the stillness of the paintings and the muted sheen of the drapes amplifying the gravity of the revelation without overwhelming it. I watched Holmes's mind at work, tracing each connection, and felt the same satisfaction that comes with the final pieces of a long puzzle clicking into place. Yet, even as the narrative unfolded, the tension remained gentle, cushioned by the warmth of our surroundings and the controlled cadence of discovery. The ruby-masked figure, now confronted, was neither villain nor caricature, but a human shaped by history, circumstance, and choices complex, deliberate, and surprisingly relatable. As Holmes paused, allowing the revelation to settle in the quiet gallery, the room seemed to hold its breath. Each echoing footstep, each flicker of candlelight, and the distant tick of the clock served as a soft punctuation. guiding listeners to reflect on the journey they had followed, from cryptic notes to hidden chambers, from fleeting glimmers of red to the intricate tapestry of human motive. The first layer of the mystery had been drawn back, leaving the promise of final resolution shimmering just ahead. The ruby-masked figure stepped forward into the gentle glow of the gallery lamps, their identity finally revealed beneath the glinting mask. Holmes's eyes sparkled with quiet satisfaction, his demeanour calm yet commanding. "It is you, of course," he said softly, "and yet the manner in which you orchestrated every detail, each subtle gesture, each carefully placed clue has been nothing short of meticulous." The figure removed the mask with a slow, deliberate motion, revealing a face marked by years of care, ambition, and a quiet but unyielding determination. Holmes motioned toward the scattered documents and artifacts, speaking in his characteristic reflective cadence. The scratches at the jeweller's shop, the coded letters guiding us to the garden, the inconsistencies in family correspondence, all these traces converged to reveal not only your identity, but the reasoning behind each action. Your motive, rooted in history, secrecy, and personal desire, became clear through the smallest of details, overlooked by all but the most observant. The warmth of the candlelight softened the tension, lending a comforting glow to the unfolding explanation. I watched in quiet awe as Holmes walked us through his deductions, explaining how each fragment of evidence, an ink smudge, a subtle hand gesture, the glimmer of red silk, had been interpreted, cross-referenced, and placed within a broader pattern. The ruby-masked figure listened intently, neither defensive nor combative, but with a sense of acknowledgement and reflection that added depth to the resolution. The thrill of the chase, the careful pursuit, and the quiet observation had led us, gently but inexorably, to understanding. Outside, London was hushed. The rain, which had begun lightly at dusk, now fell steadily, washing the streets with a soft, rhythmic patter. The lamps along the avenues cast warm, amber reflections across the wet cobblestones, and the distant murmur of life, the occasional carriage, a faint laugh, a soft closing of doors, formed a soothing soundtrack to the city's slow return to calm. Holmes and I stepped toward the window, the night offering both relief and reflection, the tension of the past hours dissolving into a serene clarity. Watson's mind, usually so attuned to observation, allowed itself a moment of quiet wonder. The excitement of near discovery, the delicate unravelling of mystery, and the gentle satisfaction of understanding mingled with a sense of relief. The ruby-masked figure's intentions were now clear, their actions comprehensible, and the story, long woven with subtlety and care, had reached its natural conclusion. Yet, even in resolution, there was a lingering appreciation for the quiet intricacies of human behaviour, for the secrets that once lay hidden, and for the calm of a night in London, illuminated by lamps and softened by rain. As the fire flickered, and the gallery settled into silence, the journey felt complete. Curiosity had been rewarded, tension resolved, and comfort restored. Listeners were left in a reflective hush, a soothing afterglow of intrigue and resolution. The city's quiet rhythm, the gentle patter of rain, and the warm glow of lights outside invited a final breath of calm, the perfect conclusion to a story of careful observation, patient deduction, and the quiet thrill of uncovering truth. And so, the secrets behind the ruby mask are finally revealed, yet the faint echoes of mystery linger softly like a shadow at the edge of memory. London resumes its gentle rhythm. Rain patters on rooftops, lamps cast a warm amber glow across the streets, and the distant hum of night carries a comforting steadiness. Holmes and Watson, quietly triumphant, returned to the familiar comfort of Baker Street, leaving us with reflections on curiosity, human motives, and the subtle interplay of secrecy and revelation. Perhaps another mystery waits silently, whispering its story just beyond the veil of ordinary life. For now we can settle back, feel the warmth of the fire, and let the calm cadence of the night linger, allowing the tale to rest gently in our minds. When the time comes, more journeys of intrigue, gentle suspense, and quiet brilliance will be ready to unfold.